Let's dive right into this explainer of Chapter 4, where we're going to unpack the incredibly complex historical and economic shifts of India's colonial era. We'll be looking at exactly how India transitioned from a completely self-sufficient global power to what the British Empire famously called the jewel in the crown. Understanding this massive transformation isn't just crucial for A-senior exams. Honestly, it is the absolute foundation for grasping the geopolitical realities of modern India today. So let's get into it.
We've got a lot of ground to cover, so here is our roadmap for today. We'll be hitting 1. The age of colonialism. 2. Why Europeans chose India. 3. Reshaping the Indian economy. 4. Rebellions and uprisings. 5. Cultural exchange and texts. And 6. We'll wrap up with a chapter summary and resources.
All right, starting with Section 1, the age of colonialism. Modern England has been made great by Indian wealth. Wealth always taken by the might and skill of the stronger. Now, William Digby wrote that in 1901, after nearly 2 centuries of British presence, and it's just a devastatingly honest summary of the colonial mission. Writing from right inside the era itself, Digby openly acknowledged that the so-called greatness of modern England was, well, essentially bankrolled by the systematic plunder of Indian wealth. This quote is absolutely vital because it completely strips away the romanticized versions of history. When a prominent figure of the era plainly points to extraction by force, it sets a pretty definitive tone for everything we're about to cover. To truly understand this era, we really need to wrap our heads around this exact definition of colonialism. It wasn't merely about winning a few battles and redrawing borders. No, it was a complete systematic takeover. Now, empires have obviously existed for millennia, but this modern European wave was uniquely comprehensive. They didn't just extract taxes. They actively dismantled local governance, completely rewrote property laws to control the agricultural economy, and aggressively pushed their own educational and cultural systems onto the indigenous populations. It was the whole shebang.
Moving right along to Section 2, Why Europeans Chose India.
You know, the European arrival wasn't just some single isolated event. It was a steady, highly calculated escalation. In 1498, Vasco da Gama made that initial contact at Calicut. Fast forward just a bit, and we see the first major wave of religious imposition with the Inquisition at Goa in 1560, and then the real economic foothold took shape. Throughout the 1600s, the English East India Company started sinking its teeth in, strategically establishing heavily fortified trading posts in key coastal hubs like Surat, Madras, and Bombay. Think about Vasco da Gama's 1498 arrival at Calicut. It was far, far more than just a navigational feat. For centuries, the incredibly lucrative trade of spices and silks had been totally monopolized by Arab and Venetian merchants. Da Gama's voyage successfully bypassed those middlemen, and it sent geopolitical shockwaves across the globe. By opening a direct sea route to India, he basically fired the starting gun for centuries of intense, ruthless rivalry among European powers who were all suddenly vying for total dominance over the subcontinent's immeasurable wealth. So, what were the imperial motivations driving these powers? Well, they were multifaceted, blending intense economic greed with religious fervor. Territorial expansion meant direct access to a literal treasure trove of natural resources. We're talking highly coveted spices, precious gems, and unparalleled textiles. Establishing new trade routes allowed them to monopolize global markets and just plunder this wealth outright. And beyond the pure economics, spreading Christianity provided a really convenient ideological justification for these early powers, basically framing their aggressive expansion as a divine mission to convert indigenous populations. Let's get into the heavy stuff in Section 3, Reshaping the Indian Economy. The contrast here is just staggering. Before the 18th century, the entire world completely coveted Indian cotton textiles, ultra-thin muslins, and beautifully embossed fabrics. India was a true global powerhouse of intricate manufacturing. But colonial policy intentionally crushed these indigenous industries. Highly skilled artisans and weavers were rapidly pushed into devastating poverty as India was forcefully deindustrialized. The nation was systematically transformed into a massive agricultural farm, existing solely to supply raw materials to fuel Britain's Industrial Revolution, and then acting as a captive market forced to buy back those very same manufactured goods. It was a perfectly engineered economic trap. You always hear about the railways, right? People often point to them as a grand gift from the empire, a great infrastructural marvel. But we have to ask, was this massive network really built for the benefit of the Indian people? This is a classic debate when discussing the so-called civilizing mission. So let's look critically at the actual historical facts here. As it turns out,
the railways were actually a highly efficient tool for economic drain. They were explicitly designed to serve imperial needs over local commerce. Traditional internal trade routes, which were often navigated by local bullock carts connecting villages, were intentionally starved of investment and bypassed altogether. Instead, the railway lines were engineered like a massive one-way conveyor belt. Their primary purpose? Moving raw materials out of the deep interior directly to the massive ports of Bombay, Calcutta, and Madras for export, while rapidly pumping British-manufactured goods back into the country. That brings us to Section 4, Rebellions and Uprisings. Obviously, this massive extraction and oppression did not go unchallenged. The sannyasis and fakirs, who traditionally traveled freely for pilgrimage, suddenly found their sacred routes taxed and criminalized by new land policies, which led them to fiercely attack British treasuries. Meanwhile, in Bengal, peasant farmers were brutalized by European planters, literally forced to abandon their vital food crops just to grow indigo for British textile dyes. And when these farmers refused to participate in their own starvation, they faced horrific torture, debt slavery, and violent attacks from hired mercenaries. But here's the thing. The brutal suppression of these uprisings didn't silence the resistance. It permanently transformed it. The bravery of the Sannyasi rebellion was immortalized in Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay's famous 1882 novel, Ananda Moth. From this deep pain and defiance emerged the iconic song Vande Mataram. Let me tell you, it became a powerful rallying cry that absolutely terrified the British administration. It inspired millions of people during the 20th century freedom movement and eventually took its rightful place as independent India's national song. Next up, Section 5, Cultural Exchange and Texts. Interestingly, while immense material wealth flowed out of India, its ancient knowledge and classical culture simultaneously began to flow into the West. In 1785, Charles Wilkins translated the Bhagavad Gita into English, publishing it as Dialogues of Krishna and Arjuna. This dissemination of ancient knowledge deeply fascinated European intellectuals and philosophers. It created a strange, striking historical paradox, really. An era defined by brutal physical and economic exploitation was also characterized by a deep, lasting reverence for Indian classical culture in global philosophical circles. Finally, Section 6, Chapter Summary and Resources. Okay, let's lock in the core narrative arc you need to remember for your exams. The initial European lure of vast natural wealth inevitably led to a highly systemic economic restructuring. This colonial machine successfully crushed local Indian industry to feed British factories. However, this intense economic and physical oppression inadvertently forged a fiercely resistant national identity, sparking massive uprisings that laid the critical groundwork for independence, all while India's classical culture quietly conquered Western philosophical thought. Now, to make sure you fully master this complex chapter and are completely ready for test day, be sure to buy our comprehensive study bundles from the link mentioned in the description below. They are absolutely packed with practice questions, deeper historical analyses, and easy-to-review notes that cover literally everything we've unpacked today. You definitely don't want to miss out on those. Before we wrap up, I'll leave you to ponder this critical question based on the evidence we've just uncovered. Did the so-called civilizing mission actually bring civilization, or just the systematic extraction of a nation's wealth? Look closely at the economic data, the true intent behind those railways, and the brutal response to local uprisings. Think critically about the grand narrative of empire, and I will catch you in the next explainer.